The sky of Xylos Prime was once a deep, beautiful violet, lit by the gentle light of its two suns, one gold, one silver. The Xylosians, a tall, slender people with kind, multifaceted eyes, built cities that looked like music frozen into crystal. Their lives were long and peaceful, filled with art, science, and quiet thought. They had no word for war in their main language. The closest they had was the Great Disagreement, and it was something they only read about in ancient history. They were a civilization at its peak, and they thought this peace would last forever. Then the Cathach came. They did not arrive with a warning or a declaration. They simply appeared at the edge of the system, a shadow that blocked the stars. Their ships were not like the Xylosians' sleek silver vessels. The Cathach fleet was a swarm of nightmares, huge, jagged things that looked like they were made of blackened bone and rusted metal, all fused together. They moved with a hungry, crawling purpose like insects searching for a meal. A great disagreement was not what they wanted. They wanted only to consume, to end, to replace the light with their own crawling darkness. The first volley of Cathach weapons shattered the Xylosian patrol fleet before they could even send a proper distress signal. The elegant Xylosian ships, built for exploration and discovery, were torn apart by brutal green energy beams that melted crystal and steel alike. Within hours, the battle was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The orbital defense stations, proud rings of light that had guarded Xylos Prime for 1,000 years, were overwhelmed. One by one, their lights went out, their signals turning to silence. That was 3 solar cycles ago. 3 long, terrible years. Now Xylos Prime was a planet under a cage. The great Cathach Armada, hundreds of their monstrous ships hung in the violet sky, blocking the twin suns. Day and night were meaningless. There was only the constant sickly green glow of the Cathach ships and the fiery orange streaks of their bombs. The planet's own shields were the only reason anyone was still alive. A massive, shimmering dome of blue energy covered the remaining cities, humming with a power that was almost gone. The Xylosians had poured all their remaining energy into this last defense, but it was failing. For 3 years, the Cathach had pounded on it, a relentless, steady drumbeat of destruction. Boom, boom, boom. The sound never stopped. It was the new heartbeat of their world. Every Xylosian felt it in their bones, a constant vibration that rattled their crystal homes and their fragile bodies. The Xylosian fleet was gone, reduced to a graveyard of glittering metal scraps floating in orbit. The orbital defenses were silent tombs, and worst of all, the colonies were gone. In the first few weeks of the siege, the Xylosians had sent desperate, frantic calls for help to their sister worlds on Xylos Secundus and Xylos Tertia. The calls went out on every channel, begging for aid, for any sign of life. At first, the Cathach jamming had blocked their signals, but then the Xylosians found a gap, a tiny window to send their message. The message went out, and the only thing that came back was empty, cold silence. The Cathach had not just come for Xylos Prime, they had come for all of them. The Xylosians were the last ones left. They were completely, terrifyingly alone. Hope was not just lost. It was a word from a different life. It was a forgotten luxury, like sunlight on your face or a sky clear of enemies. Now there was only survival, and even that was measured in minutes. The blue shield that protected them was flickering. It used to be a strong, steady light, but now it would stutter and fade like a dying candle. With every massive boom from the enemy ships, the shield would ripple and groan, and sometimes a green beam of energy would punch through, carving a new, smoking canyon into the planet's surface. The Xylosians no longer looked at the sky with fear. They looked at it with a dull, tired acceptance. The children born during the siege had never seen their sons. They only knew the trembling ground and the green-lit darkness. The adults simply went about their duties, rationing food, repairing shield generators that could not be repaired, and waiting for the end. The Cathach were patient. They were winning. It was only a matter of time before the shield broke for good, and the great disagreement would finally be over. The bunker was quiet, but it was a heavy, sick kind of quiet. It was buried deep beneath the crystal capital, far from the surface. Up above, the beautiful musical cities were now just jagged piles of broken glass and smoking ruins. Down here there was no crystal. There was only cold, gray stone and thick metal doors built to withstand a pressure that was now finally coming for them. The air was stale, smelling of tired, frightened people and hot machinery. The only light came from the soft blue glow of holographic screens, and always there was the sound A low, constant thud, thud, thud that came from the world above. It was the sound of the Kathak bombs hitting the dying shield over and over. It felt like being trapped inside a giant drum while a monster beat on it. High Commander Theron stood in the center of the room, staring at the largest hologram. It was a beautiful spinning image of their world, Xylos Prime. Or at least how it used to be. Now the image was covered in angry red symbols. The red symbols were the Kathak fleet. The planet itself was wrapped in a flickering, pale blue bubble. This was their shield, the last thing keeping them alive. And Theron could see it failing. It rippled and sparked, and with every thud from outside, a part of it would fade for a second. Theron was an old Xylosian. His multifaceted eyes, which should have been bright and clear like purple jewels, were now dull and gray, clouded with exhaustion and grief. He had been commander for 50 peaceful years. He had managed trade routes and scientific explorations. Now he was the commander of the end of his world. He felt the weight of every single life on the planet pressing down on his shoulders. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He just watched the map, hoping for a miracle he knew would not come. A young officer named Lyra walked up to him. She was his best tactical adept, quick-thinking and brave. She had been born in the peace, and she was going to die in the war. She held her body stiffly, trying to look professional, but Theron could see the slight tremble in her hands. She stopped beside him and looked at the big map. "Hi, Commander," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it cut through the humming sound of the bunker. "It's happening." She pointed to the map. One of the red symbols, a massive one much larger than the others, was moving. It was slowly, carefully floating into a new position, high above the planet's north pole. It was a final sterilizing orbit. The Kathak had stopped playing. They were tired of waiting for the shield to break. This was the command ship, and it was moving into place to fire its main weapon. A weapon that wouldn't just break the shield. It would punch through it and boil the oceans, burning the air and turning the whole surface of Xylos Prime into black melted rock. It was the end. The other members of the final council sat at a long stone table behind Theron. They were the oldest and wisest of their people. The chief scientist, the head engineer, the high philosopher. They heard Lyra's words and none of them moved. They were beyond panic, beyond tears. Their faces were just empty, defeated. Their bright, complex eyes were all fixed on the map, watching that one big red symbol move into place. They had no more ideas, no more tricks, no more defenses. They were just waiting to die. Theron finally tore his eyes away from the map. He turned to Lyra. His voice was rough, like two stones rubbing together. "The archive," he said. "Is it ready?" This was their last act. Not an act of war, but an act of memory. For the last year, as the Kathak hammered them, a small secret team had been gathering everything. All of their science. All of their art. Their music, their history, their language, their philosophy. They even included the genetic codes of their trees, their animals, and their own people. It was a complete copy of their entire civilization, their whole soul, squeezed into a tiny diamond-hard data pod no bigger than a child's hand. It was not a call for help. It was too late for help. It was just a message to the empty black void of space. A message that said, "We were here. We lived, we mattered. Please remember us." Lyra nodded. She moved to a smaller console in the corner. On its screen was a single glowing button. This console controlled a special one-time use transmitter. It wouldn't fire a rocket, which the Kathak would see and destroy. Instead, it would fold space for less than a second, a tiny pinprick in reality, and squirt the data pod into the unknown, aimed at nothing but away. Theron looked at the council. One by one, they met his gaze and nodded. He turned back to Lyra. "Do it," he said. Lyra took a deep, shaky breath. She placed her long, slender finger over the button. For 1 second, she paused. She was thinking of the sunlight she would never see again, the crystal cities that were gone forever. Then she pressed it. A small light on the console flashed green, then red. A quiet beep echoed in the room. It was done. Their entire world, their whole history, was now a tiny speck, flying silently and alone through the cold, empty darkness of space. In the bunker, everyone let out a breath they didn't know they were holding. There was nothing left to do. They had sent their goodbye. Now they just had to wait for the end. Lyra's finger lifted from the glowing button. It was done. A small beep confirmed the launch. Their entire soul, their music, their art, their science, was now a tiny, invisible speck floating away into the dark, silent ocean of space. In the bunker, the heavy, thick quiet returned, broken only by the steady thud, thud, thud from the Kethak ships above. High Commander Theron closed his eyes for just a second. He had failed to save his people, but he had saved their memory. It was a cold, bitter comfort. He and his council now just had to wait for the end, which the Kethak command ship was ready to deliver. Then a new sound filled the room. It was not a thud. It was a shriek. A piercing, tearing electronic scream that no one had ever heard before. It came from Lyra's console. Every Xylosian in the room jumped. The council members shot to their feet, their multifaceted eyes wide with new panic. "What is it?" Theron demanded, his first cold thought being that the Kethak had detected their archive launch and were now firing directly at the bunker. Lyra's hands were flying across her controls, her face a mask of pure confusion. The alarm was still screaming, a noise that felt like it was ripping their nerves apart. "Sir," she yelled over the sound, "it's not the Kethak. The alarm, it's not a weapons lock. It's a spatial sensor. The sensors on the outer shield ring are going crazy." "What do you mean, crazy?" Theron snapped, rushing to her side. Lyra pointed a shaking finger at her screen. It was full of numbers that were spinning so fast they were just a blur. "The readings are impossible, sir. The fabric of space-time itself. It's tearing. The system says it's an unidentified spatial anomaly. Put it on the main screen." "Now," Theron commanded. The large holographic map of Xylos Prime vanished. It was replaced by a live video feed from their last damaged telescope, clinging to the outside of the flickering shield. The image was grainy, full of static, but it showed the blackness of space just beyond their shattered moon. It showed the dark, ugly shapes of the Kethak fleet hanging there like spiders. And then, they all saw it. The stars began to move. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't an energy beam. It was the blackness of space itself breaking, like a sheet of black glass being hit by an invisible hammer. A crack appeared. It started small, just a pinpoint of light, and then ripped open. It wasn't a clean, neat hole. It was a raw, jagged, and chaotic tear. From inside this tear in reality, a sick, violent light pulsed, a mix of angry red and deep purple, like a fresh bleeding wound in the sky. It looked wrong. It looked like physics was throwing up. And then the most impossible thing of all happened. The thudding stopped. The constant 3-year-long drumbeat of the Kethak bombs just stopped. The sudden absolute silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. In the bunker, the only sound was the high-pitched shriek of Lyra's console and the suddenly loud hum of the air filters. Lyra quickly brought up the tactical map on a side screen. The red symbols of the Kethak ships were no longer attacking. They had all stopped, frozen in space. Even the massive command ship, the one that had been moving into place to kill their planet, had paused its final journey. The entire Kethak armada, the unstoppable swarm that had eaten system after system, had turned away from Xylos Prime. They were all turning to face this new terrible thing. "A natural phenomenon," one of the council members whispered, his voice trembling. "A wormhole?" Lyra shook her head, her eyes glued to the numbers on her screen. "No," she breathed. "The energy coming from it. It's not gamma rays, it's not radiation. The readings don't make sense. It's just raw, chaotic, unbridled energy. It's not natural. It can't be." High Commander Theron stared at the main screen. The tear in space was now huge, wider than their moon. It pulsed with that sick red light. He watched as the Kethak, the monsters who had hunted his people to extinction, formed a new, defensive line between this anomaly and their own ships. The Kethak were afraid of it. A cold, heavy dread settled in Theron's chest, heavier than any grief he had felt before. What could possibly scare the Kethak? What new universe-breaking horror had they just witnessed? This wasn't help. This wasn't salvation. This was just a bigger, scarier monster coming to the fight. "It must be one of their weapons," he said, his voice flat and dead. "A Kethak superweapon. Or," he paused, "maybe it's their enemy. Something that was chasing them." Either way, the Xylosians were just grass caught between two giants. The brief, sad peace they had made with their own end was gone. Now there was only a new, sharp, and terrible fear. They all just watched the screen, prisoners in their own planet, as the jagged, bleeding wound in space pulsed, and waited for the new, more terrible death to finally emerge from the void. The heavy, awful silence in the bunker stretched for a long, terrible minute. Everyone stared at the main screen, at the jagged, red-lined tear in space. The Cathach fleet, hundreds of bone and metal ships, had forgotten about Xylos Prime. They were all facing this new, impossible wound in the sky. They were waiting. The Xylosians were waiting. Then the anomaly pulsed. It pulsed once, twice, and on the third pulse it didn't just glow. It vomited. Something punched its way out of the tear. It wasn't a smooth, graceful exit, like a Xylosian ship slipping into the void. This was a violent, messy, and loud explosion of energy. Lyra's console didn't just shriek. It let out a deep, groaning wail as the sensors were hit by a shockwave of displaced energy. Even deep underground in the bunker, High Commander Theron felt the floor vibrate. It was a thunderous physical shove. The new thing had not arrived in their system. It had kicked the door down. For a few seconds, the light from the anomaly was too bright to see. When it faded, the ship was just sitting there, and everyone in the bunker stared, confused and horrified. It was the ugliest thing Theron had ever seen. Xylosian ships were things of beauty, like silver leaves or musical notes. The Cathach ships were terrifying, yes, but they had an organic, bone-like design that made sense, like a shark or a wasp. This ship was an insult. It was a brick. A massive, lumpy gray brick covered in scars. It wasn't smooth. It was made of hundreds of flat metal plates, all bolted or welded together. It wasn't even the same on both sides. One side had a huge, thick tube sticking out, while the other side was covered in a cluster of sensor dishes and antennas. It looked like a child had built it from scraps, but it was the scars that held Theron's attention. The ship was covered in them. There were huge black blast marks staining the gray metal. There were deep craters as if it had been hit by small asteroids, and there were long, deep scratches like a giant cat had tried to tear it open. This was not a ship for exploring or for carrying cargo. This was a ship that had been to hell and back over and over, and had won every single time through sheer, ugly stubbornness. Then Theron saw the weapons. The ship bristled with them. They were everywhere, and they were primitive. He saw dozens of large, round, black holes in the hull. Cannons. Barbaric weapons that use chemical explosions to fire solid pieces of metal at an enemy. The Xylosians had stopped using projectile weapons thousands of years ago. They were inefficient, messy, and brutal. And next to these cannons were other weapons, sputtering with raw, barely contained blue energy. They weren't the focused, clean lances of Xylosian design. They looked like open, angry wounds in the ship's hull, just leaking power into the void. The chief engineer on the council whispered, "Inefficient. Look at the power bleed. They must have to refuel every day. It's horribly designed." But Theron saw something else. He saw a ship that didn't care about efficiency. It didn't care about beauty. It was a giant flying hammer, and it looked like it saw the entire universe as a nail. Lyra's hands were flying over her console. "Sir," she said, her voice a high-pitched whisper of disbelief. "Sir, I can't scan it. What do you mean?" Theron said, not taking his eyes off the gray monster. "There's no signature," she said. "The Cathach ships, they run on bioenergy. I can read that. Our ships run on crystal resonance. I can read that. This thing, it's giving off nothing. It's a ghost. It's just there. It has no energy readings I recognize. It's not in any database. It's not Cathach. It's not Xylosian. It's not from any known species." The ugly gray ship just floated in the blackness, silent. It was impossibly, terrifyingly still. It sat in the empty space between the dying planet and the massive Cathach armada. One ship. One scarred, asymmetrical, primitive ship. It was outnumbered hundreds to one, and it just sat there as if it were waiting. As if it were bored. The Cathach were still frozen. They didn't fire. They too were staring at this new piece on the board, a piece that had come from nowhere, following no rules. In the bunker, the hope that had flickered for a second was gone, replaced by a new, cold dread. This was not a friend. Friends did not look like that. This was just a new flavor of death, a brutal metal death that had just emerged from a bleeding hole in reality. Theron gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. The Cathach were a nightmare, he understood. This new thing. This was the unknown. The silence in the deep bunker was so thick it felt like being smothered. High Commander Theron, Lyra, and the entire council just stared at the main screen. In the cold blackness of space, the Cathach armada, 100 strong, was frozen in a silent standoff with the single ugly gray ship. The Cathach, the monsters of the galaxy, seemed confused. They had stopped their attack. Their entire fleet now focused on this one impossible newcomer. It was like a pack of giant, hungry wolves suddenly stopping to stare at a badger that had just crawled out of the ground. The Cathak command ship, the massive one that had been moving to kill their planet, was the first to act. It sent a signal. It wasn't a voice. It was a horrible screeching noise like metal tearing mixed with a deep psychic push. It was a signal of pure dominance, a sound meant to cause terror and demand submission. It was the Cathak's way of saying, "Who are you and why are you in our feeding ground?" The screeching sound filled the bunker, making the Xylosian's sensitive ears ache. But before the signal could even finish its horrible roar, it was cut off. It didn't fade out. It was cut. It was as if a physical blade had sliced the sound in half. 1 second, the screech was everywhere. The next, there was perfect, total silence. And then a new signal blasted through every speaker, every console, every communication device in the bunker. It wasn't clean or elegant. It was a crackle, a deafening roar of pure white noise static. It was so loud and so powerful that it completely overrode the Cathak's own jamming field. For 3 years, that jamming had been a solid wall, cutting Xylos Prime off from the universe. This new signal tore through it like it was paper. Lyra gasped as her console lit up with warnings. The signal was raw, unfiltered, and incredibly strong. Then out of the static, a voice spoke. It was a deep, rough sound, like gravel being ground together. It was guttural, low, and full of friction. To the Xylosians, whose voices were like soft music, this sounded like the mountain itself had learned to speak, and it was speaking their language. Sort of. The voice was speaking Xylos Standard, the common language of trade and diplomacy, but it was terrible. The accent was thick and heavy, pronouncing all the soft sounds as hard, sharp ones. It was clear the speaker was struggling, as if they were reading the words from a very old, very bad translation guide. "This is," the voice growled, followed by a short burst of static, as if the speaker was coughing or clearing their throat. "This is the Aegis-class warship, Indomitable, of the Human Systems Alliance." The names meant nothing. Lyra's fingers were already flying across her database. Aegis. Nothing. Indomitable. Nothing. Human Systems Alliance. Nothing. The database, which held records of every known species in the galaxy, was completely blank. The voice continued, slower this time. "We received a fragmented distress call." There was another pause, longer this time. Then the voice said, "We see you're in a bit of trouble. A bit of trouble." Theron stared at the screen. His planet was dying. His fleet was dust. His people were huddled in the dark, waiting for extinction at the hands of hundreds of enemy ships. "And this voice, called it a bit of trouble." "Human," whispered the high philosopher from the council table. He was the oldest one there, his multifaceted eyes clouded with age and knowledge. He had risen from his seat and was walking slowly towards the screen. "Human," he said again, louder. "It cannot be vice. What is it?" Theron asked, turning to the old Xylosian. "What is a human?" "They are not a what, Commander?" the philosopher said, his voice trembling. "They are a story, a myth, a ghost tale we tell children to frighten them." Lyra looked up from her console. "Sir, he's right. The word only appears in the mythology and forbidden history files. They're called the ghosts of the dead quadrant." The philosopher nodded, his eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and awe. "The stories are 10,000 years old. They spoke of a species from a dangerous, unstable part of space. A species that was unbalanced. They were loud, violent, dangerously emotional, and brilliant. They built empires in centuries and destroyed them in a single day. They were rumored to have fought a great war amongst themselves, a war so terrible that it burned their own star system and poisoned their worlds." He pointed a shaky finger at the screen. "They are supposed to be extinct, Commander. Wiped out by their own hand. They are a lesson, a boogeyman, a story of a species that burned too hot and died screaming. They are not real." Theron looked back at the screen. He saw the ugly, gray, scarred ship, a ship that looked like it had been built for nothing but violence. He heard the rough, gravelly voice that spoke their language like a brute. He heard the insane, calm understatement. A bit of trouble. The Xylosians were stunned into a new, deeper silence. The Cathak Armada was still silent too. Hope was lost, yes, but something else had just arrived. A myth from a 10,000-year-old horror story had just emerged from a hole in reality, and it was answering their call. For a long moment, the universe held its breath. The Cathak Armada, the human warship, and the dying Xylosian race all hung in a perfect, terrible silence. The gravelly, impossible voice of the human still echoed in the bunker. The Cathach command ship, the giant that had been moving to end Xylos Prime, was the first to break the silence. Its surprise was over. This new ship, this single ugly piece of metal, had dared to interrupt its hunt. It did not matter what it was. It only mattered that it was in the way. In the bunker, High Commander Theron saw it happen on the main screen. A new sickly green light began to glow deep within the Cathach command ship. It was not like the small, repetitive lights of the bombs that had hit their shield. This was a deep, terrible gathering of power. No, Lyra whispered, her eyes wide. That's its primary weapon. The energy lance. The one it was going to use on us. The Xylosians watched in frozen horror. This was the planet killer, a beam of focused, dark energy capable of boiling oceans and cracking continents. And it was now being aimed at the lone gray ship. Move! Theron found himself shouting at the screen. Dodge, get out of the way! Xylosian battle philosophy was built on speed, elegance, and evasion. You never ever took a direct hit from a primary weapon. It was suicide. The human ship, the Indomitable, did not move. It just sat there. It didn't turn. It didn't accelerate. It didn't try to run. It simply faced the Cathach command ship, defiant and still like a mountain waiting for a storm. They're insane, the Council's chief engineer breathed. They're just going to let it hit them? The green light on the Cathach ship pulsed, and then it fired. A solid, massive beam of pure green-black destruction shot across the void. It was thicker than the human ship itself. It moved with terrifying speed, and it struck the Indomitable dead center. The Xylosians in the bunker flinched. Several of them cried out. They expected the ship to vanish, to be atomized, to become nothing but superheated gas. But it didn't. At the very last nanosecond, a shimmer appeared around the human ship. It wasn't a clean, hard-edged energy bubble like the Xylosian shield. It looked like rippling water, like a heat haze in the desert. When the massive green lance hit this shimmering barrier, the barrier didn't break. It bent. It buckled inwards, caving under the immense pressure. The Xylosians could see the gray metal of the Indomitable begin to glow bright, cherry red underneath the shield as the heat cooked it. The entire ship was pushed backward several kilometers by the sheer kinetic force of the beam. The shield rippled and sparked, and for one terrible second it looked like it would collapse. Then the Cathach beam stopped. The green light faded. The Indomitable was still there. It was smoking. Parts of its outer hull were melted and slagged. It was scarred and burned, but it was whole. The shimmering, strange barrier faded, and the ship just floated there, steaming in the cold of space. For a second, the Cathach fleet just stared. They had hit this single, tiny enemy with a weapon that could kill a planet, and it was still alive. Then the Indomitable did the unthinkable. Xylosian strategy would be to retreat, to jump away and repair. The human ship did the opposite. Deep in its stern, new lights flickered to life. They were not the soft, silent glow of Xylosian drives. They were three massive circular engines that suddenly ignited with a light so bright it hurt the eyes. They burned with a brilliant, furious, angry blue. The ship, which had been still, suddenly jumped forward. It didn't just accelerate. It charged. Like a bull a hunter has just wounded, the Indomitable aimed itself straight at the heart of the Cathach fleet. It didn't go around. It went through. What are they doing? Lyra shrieked. They're charging the entire armada. They're outnumbered hundreds to one. The human ship was a gray streak of pure suicidal rage, and as it charged, its primitive weapons came to life. It didn't fire silent energy beams. Instead, the Xylosians heard a new sound over the open channel, a sound that pounded in their chests. Thump, 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 thump. All along the sides of the gray ship, the black circular cannons erupted with fire and smoke. They were firing massive solid slug projectiles. Chunks of metal, the size of Xylosian ground cars, were being thrown at the enemy with terrifying speed. The Xylosian engineer had called them inefficient. He was wrong. When a Xylosian energy lance hit a Cathach's organic, bone-like hull, it would burn and melt a small hole. When one of these human slugs hit, it didn't melt. It smashed. The first volley hit a Cathach cruiser. The Xylosians watched as the high-velocity metal projectiles punched through the Cathach's bone armor, shattering it into a million pieces. The projectiles didn't stop. They tore through the ship from one side and out the other, leaving gaping, ragged holes. Green Kethak blood and internal fluids instantly vaporized in the vacuum, creating a cloud of green steam. The Kethak ship, mortally wounded, began to drift, its systems dead. Thump, thump, thump. The Indomitable fired again and again, plunging deeper into the fleet, taking hits from smaller Kethak ships and just ignoring them. It was a brawler in a ring of fencers. It was not fighting a war. It was starting a bar fight. And with every shot it tore another Kethak ship to pieces with contemptuous, brutal ease. In the deep, dark bunker, the Zalosians could only watch, their breath trapped in their chests. The shock of the human ship's arrival had turned into a new, burning, impossible hope. But now that hope was turning to horror. The Indomitable was magnificent. It was a raging, furious beast, but it was one beast. The Kethak fleet was a sea of hundreds. The Kethak had recovered from their shock. They were angry. They were a swarm, and this single gray ship had just stung them hard. Now the entire swarm was turning to crush it. From every direction, green energy lances, the same kind that had shattered the Zylosian fleet, lashed out. They sliced across the Indomitable's hull, and this time the human ship's strange, shimmering shield was not holding. It was flickering and failing. "They're taking too much damage," Lyra said, her voice shaking as she stared at her sensor readings. The holographic image of the human ship on the main screen showed new, gaping holes. A huge gash was torn open near its engines. One of the three massive blue lights was gone, sputtered out into blackness. Thick black smoke, in the vacuum of space, was pouring from a dozen smaller holes. The ship's gray metal was glowing cherry red in several places, melted like hot wax. The Indomitable was dying. It was slowing down. It was clear to everyone in the bunker that this was the end. The Zylosian's brief, impossible hope began to die with it. But the human ship was not dying quietly. It was not dying alone. It was dying like a cornered wolverine with teeth bared and claws out. It was no longer charging. It was just a spinning, angry ball of wreckage that refused to stop fighting. "By the twin suns," the chief engineer whispered, pointing at the tactical map. "Look at that." A Kethak cruiser, a ship 5 times the size of the Indomitable, swooped in from above, its weapons glowing, ready for the killing blow. The Indomitable was too damaged to dodge. It couldn't even turn properly. So it didn't. It just fired its last working side cannons. Thump, thump, thump. The solid metal slug smashed into the Kethak ship's bridge, shattering it. The cruiser, its brain destroyed, went dark and began to drift aimlessly, dead in the water. Lyra was staring at her own console, her multifaceted eyes wide in disbelief. Their trade," she stammered. "I don't understand. What is it, Adept?" High Commander Theron asked, his voice low. "Sir," she said, "they've taken 14, 15, 16 critical hull breaches. They are being torn apart, but for every hit they take, they are destroying 3 Kethak cruisers." She looked at Theron, her face a mask of confusion and awe. "They aren't trying to win. They aren't trying to escape. They are just trying to take as many of the enemy with them as they possibly can. Who does that? What kind of species fights like this?" The Indomitable was now barely moving. It was surrounded. It was a trap. The Kethak fleet had it, and they knew it. The green beams stopped. The Kethak ships paused, as if to savor their victory. And then that gravelly, rough human voice came back over the open channel. It was weak. It was full of static and a painful, wet, coughing sound. The human captain was clearly wounded, probably dying. But his voice was not full of fear. It was full of a cold, terrifying fury. "This is..." The captain coughed, a terrible rattling sound. "This is the captain of the Indomitable. You creatures, you think you've won?" Another Kethak ship, a smaller one, fired a warning shot that splashed against the human's failing shield. The voice on the radio just laughed, a short, bitter sound. "We came here for strangers. We don't even know their names. We got a call, a piece of a call, and we came." The voice was getting stronger again, louder, filled with a sudden, impossible energy. "But you attack the weak. You burn worlds that can't fight back. You kill for food. We just cannot let that stand." There was a muffled shout in the background of the human's broadcast, and then the captain's voice came back, not as a weak, dying man, but as a full-throated roar that shook the very speakers in the Zylosian bunker. "This is for the lost. This is for the fallen. This is for the principle of the thing." "Principle?" one of the council members whispered. What? What does that mean? Theron didn't answer. He was watching the Indomitable. It was moving again. Its last two engines flared, burning with a light that was too bright and unstable white-hot blue. "Sir," Lyra yelled. "Their engine core. The FTL drive. They're overloading it. They are turning their whole ship into a bomb." The Indomitable, in its final act, had become a spear, a burning, dying spear of pure human defiance. It wasn't trying to fight the small ships anymore. It was aimed at only one target, the Cathach command ship, the flagship, the monster that had been about to kill their world. The Cathach flagship saw it coming. It tried to fire its massive planet-killer lance, but it was too late. The Indomitable, in its last suicidal blaze of glory, rammed straight into the side of the massive enemy vessel. For 1/2 second, there was silence. The two ships were stuck together, one a giant, the other a broken dagger buried in its ribs. Then the Indomitable's FTL core detonated. There was no sound. There was only light. A new sun was born in the sky of Xylos Prime. It was a silent, blinding white-blue explosion that was so bright, every sensor in the bunker went blind. Every screen turning to pure, burning white. When the Xylosians could see again, they stared at the screen. The spot where the Cathach flagship had been was just empty space. It was gone, vaporized, instantly erased from existence, and the dozen or so elite Royal Guard ships that had been protecting it? They were gone too, wiped away like dust in the Indomitable. The Indomitable was gone with them. The light from the explosion was brighter than their two suns. It was not a beam or a blast, but a single, silent flash that instantly turned every screen in the bunker to pure, blinding white. The Xylosians cried out, throwing their hands over their multifaceted eyes. The floor beneath their feet did not just vibrate. It jumped, a single, hard shockwave that felt like the planet itself had been punched. Then came the silence. It was a new kind of silence. Not the heavy, waiting silence from before. This was a dead, empty, ringing silence. The constant thud, thud, thud of the Cathach bombs. The sound that had been the heartbeat of their world for 3 long years was gone. The alarms on Lyra's console were gone, killed by the blast's energy wave. The bunker was completely, totally quiet. The screens. High Commander Theron whispered, his voice hoarse.
"Get the screens back. I'm trying, sir,"
Lyra said, her hands flying over a console that was now dark. The energy wave. It overloaded everything. Our external sensors are all blind. For a full minute, they were trapped in the dark gray bunker, knowing nothing. They were alive, but they didn't know if the Cathach were still there. They didn't know if the human ship's desperate gamble had worked. The silence was almost worse than the bombing. Then, one by one, the screens flickered back to life. The main hologram in the center of the room sputtered, filled with static, and then cleared. The image it showed was the blackness of space. Where is it?" one of the council members asked, stepping closer. "Where is the Cathach command ship?" Lyra ran a check, her fingers trembling. "It's gone, sir," she breathed. "The sensors. There's nothing there. No metal, no energy, no wreckage. It's just gone, vaporized." The spot where the massive enemy flagship had been was now just empty space, but the rest of the Cathach fleet was still there. Hundreds of them. The Xylosians' hearts sank. The humans had sacrificed themselves just to kill one ship. It was brave, it was insane, but it wasn't enough. The Armada was still there, but the Armada was not attacking. The red symbols on the tactical map were frozen. Theron zoomed the main screen in on a cluster of Cathach cruisers. They were drifting, they were not firing. They were not moving into formation. They just floated aimlessly. The Cathach were a hive mind. They were like a giant single creature, with every ship connected to one brain. The Indomitable hadn't just destroyed a ship. It had destroyed the brain. And now the rest of the body was lost. It was stupid. It had no one to tell it what to do. On the screen, the Xylosians watched as 2 Cathach ships, leaderless and confused, slowly drifted into each other. They bumped, a gentle, clumsy collision, and then just sat there, stuck together. Another ship fired its weapons, but not at Xylos Prime. It fired randomly into empty space, a flash of green light that hit nothing. Then the panic started. One ship, near the edge of the fleet, suddenly turned. It didn't jump to faster than light speed. It just turned its engines on full and began to run, fleeing back into the void. A second later, another ship did the same. Then a dozen. Then 100. It was not a retreat. A retreat is organized. This was a rout. This was a mindless swarm of insects. Their nest destroyed, now scattering in every direction, desperate to get away. They were leaderless, terrified, and broken. The great, unstoppable Cathok Armada, the monsters that had eaten half the galaxy, were running away. They were running from the ghost of a single, ugly, gray ship. In the bunker, no one cheered. No one cried. No one moved. They just stood and watched in a deep, profound, stunned silence. The sky of Xylos Prime, which had been full of green, glowing enemies for 3 years, was slowly becoming empty. Lyra's console beeped. She had been scanning the blast site. She put the image on the main screen. The Cathok flagship was gone. The Indomitable was gone. There was no wreckage. No hull plates. No sign that 2 giant ships had just died there. All that was left was a cloud. A faint, shimmering, beautiful cloud of glittering dust catching the light of the distant stars. It was the metal of the human ship blasted into a fine, sparkling mist. It was the only grave the humans would ever have. Lyra stared at that cloud of dust, and a single hot tear rolled down her cheek and dropped onto her console. "They're gone," she whispered. "They're all gone." High Commander Theron walked slowly to the main screen. He looked at the last few red dots of the Cathok fleet as they vanished into deep space. They were safe. His people were safe. They had been pulled back from the very edge of total extinction. He looked at the glittering dust cloud. He thought of the gravelly voice. A bit of trouble. He thought of the final defiant roar. For the principle of the thing, they were saved, but they had not saved themselves. They had been rescued by a myth, a boogeyman from a dead quadrant of space. A phantom species that had crossed the dark, empty void, taken one look at an impossible fight, and decided to die, not for victory, not for gain, but just to save total strangers. They had died for a principle. The silence in the bunker continued. It was the new sound of their world, the sound of being alive, the sound of being confused, and the sound of being forever in debt to the ghosts who had come from the void.